The rain in Oakhaven didn't fall at hammered. It turned the main street into a river of black sludge, sucking at the boots of the men gathered in the square and splashing mud onto the hem of Elara Vance's threadbare dress. She stood on the raised wooden platform outside the Mercantile, shivering violently, her hands clasped so tightly in front of her that her knuckles were white. She was 23, but in the gray light of the storm she looked like a ghost. She wore a heavy woolen shawl wrapped around her head and shoulders, pulled forward to hide her face. It was an instinct born of 10 years of whispers, 10 years of children screaming when they saw her, 10 years of being the monster of Oakhaven. Mayor Abernathy paced in front of her. He was a small, round man with a face like a dried apple and eyes that glittered with malice. He held a ledger in one hand and a gavel in the other. "Order!" he shouted over the roar of the rain. "Order, you mongrels!" The crowd of miners and drifters quieted, though a few jeers still rang out. They were here for the spectacle. The Vance farm had failed. Old Man Vance was dead, buried in a pauper's grave last week, and now his daughter and his debts were the town's property. "We have one lot left," Abernathy bellowed, gesturing to Elara with the gavel. "The girl. She comes with the deed to the rocky acres east of the creek. Not much land, but it's something." He looked at Elara with undisguised contempt. "She can cook," he continued, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "She can sew. She can read, for what that's worth to a man." "Let's see her," a voice shouted from the back. "Is she the one with the face?" Laughter rippled through the crowd. It was a cruel, jagged sound that cut deeper than the cold wind. Elara shrank into her shawl. "Please," she prayed silently, "please let it be over. Let someone just take the land and ignore me." Abernathy grinned. He knew how to work a crowd. He knew how to turn misery into entertainment. "You want to see the merchandise?" he asked, stepping closer to her. "You want to know what you're buying?" He reached out. Elara gasped, trying to pull away, but he was too fast. He grabbed the edge of her shawl and ripped it from her head. The wool fell into the mud. Elara stood exposed. Her long, dark hair was plastered to her skull by the rain. The right side of her face was perfect pale, smooth skin, a large dark eye, a delicate cheekbone. But the left side was a ruin. It was a landscape of melted flesh. Shiny pink and white scar tissue started at her temple, consumed her ear, and flowed down her neck like wax melting down a candle. It pulled at the corner of her eye and her mouth, freezing half her face in a permanent grimace of pain. The crowd gasped, then silence, then a murmur of revulsion. "Damaged goods!" Abernathy screamed, pointing at her face as if it were a crime. "Look at it! A monster! Who will take this burden off our hands? Do I hear $5? $5 for the land and the creature?" "I wouldn't take her for free," a miner yelled. "She'd sour the milk just looking at it." $2, Abernathy pleaded, desperation creeping into his voice. $2, someone take her. We can't feed her in the poorhouse." Elara closed her eyes. Hot tears mixed with the cold rain on her face. She wasn't a person. She wasn't Elara, who loved poetry and knew how to heal a sick calf. She was a ledger entry, a liability, a monster. $1, Abernathy shrieked. $1 for the damaged goods. No one spoke. The men looked at their boots. The rain fell harder. If you are liking this story, please subscribe. I know you must have subscribed by now, so let's continue. The sound of hooves broke the silence. It wasn't the clip-clop of a carriage horse. It was a heavy, earth-shaking thud. Boom, boom, boom. The crowd parted. They didn't just step aside, they scrambled back, pressing themselves against the walls of the buildings, fear evident in their eyes. A rider emerged from the gloom. He rode a massive draft horse, a Clydesdale with shaggy fetlocks that were caked in mud. The beast was huge, breathing steam into the cold air. But the rider was even more terrifying. He was a mountain of a man. He wore a coat made of thick, blackened leather that looked like armor. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed his face, but a beard as black as coal and thick as wire brush covered his jaw. His shoulders were impossibly broad. He sat in the saddle with the stillness of a predator. Silas Vane, the Iron Man. He lived in the Devil's Throat, high in the peaks where the storms were born. They said he was a blacksmith who had gone mad. They said he forged weapons for demons. They said he hadn't spoken a word in 5 years. He rode into the square. The mud squelched under his horse's hooves. He stopped right in front of the platform. Abernathy swallowed hard. He looked tiny next to the rider. "Mr. Vane," he stammered, we didn't expect you." Silas didn't speak. He just sat there, the rain drumming on his leather coat. Then slowly he turned his head. He looked at Elara. He didn't look at her good side. He looked straight at the scar. His eyes, hidden in the shadow of his hat, were unreadable. He didn't flinch. He didn't recoil. He just looked. Elara felt a strange heat rise in her chest. She wanted to cover her face, but her shawl was in the mud. She forced herself to stand still, to let the monster see the monster. Silas shifted. He reached into his coat. The crowd held its breath. Was he reaching for a gun? A knife? He pulled out a heavy leather pouch. He tossed it. It hit the platform at Abernathy's feet with a heavy metallic clank. It sounded like rocks falling. Abernathy stared at it. He bent down and opened the drawstring. He gasped. Gold Spanish doubloons, old, heavy, and worth more than the entire town of Oakhaven. Silas rumbled. His voice was like a rockslide, deep, rough, unused. It vibrated in Elara's chest. Abernathy scrambled to pick up the pouch, Breed overcoming his fear. "Sold! Sold to Mr. Vane! The land is yours! The girl is yours! No returns!" Silas nudged his horse forward. The massive beast stepped up to the platform. Silas reached down. Elara flinched. She expected a blow. She expected him to grab her by the hair. Instead, his large, calloused hand closed around her waist. It was firm, but not cruel. He lifted her effortlessly, swinging her up onto the saddle in front of him. She landed against his chest. He smelled of iron, coal smoke, and wet leather. He was a furnace of heat against the freezing rain. He didn't say a word. He unbuttoned his massive coat and wrapped the edge of it around her, shielding her from the storm, shielding her from the stares of the town. "Hold on," he growled. He kicked the horse. They surged forward, leaving the mud, the gavel, and the cruel laughter of Oakhaven behind. Elara clung to the saddle horn, her face pressed against the rough wool of his shirt, listening to the steady, thundering beat of his heart as they climbed toward the dark, jagged peaks where only the monsters lived. The climb into the Devil's Throat was a journey into a white, howling purgatory. The rain that had soaked Oakhaven turned to sleet, then to a blinding horizontal snow that stung like buckshot. Elara huddled against Silas's chest, buried in the immense leather coat that smelled of sulfur and old smoke. She couldn't feel her feet. She couldn't feel her hands. All she could feel was the terrifying, silent heat of the man holding her. He didn't speak. He didn't curse the storm. He navigated the treacherous, narrow switchbacks with a grim, practiced competence. Every so often, the massive horse would stumble on the slick granite, and Silas would grunt a low vibration against her back, tightening his grip around her waist, anchoring her to the saddle. Hours bled into a gray, timeless haze. Finally, the horse crested a ridge that seemed to jut out over the edge of the world. "Home," Silas rasped. The word was a rusty hinge opening a door that hadn't moved in years. Elara peered out from the coat. It wasn't a house. It was a fortress of industry. Built directly into the jagged face of the cliff, the cabin was a monstrous structure of blackened logs and roughly hewn stone. A massive chimney belched thick black smoke into the storm, staining the snow gray. But it was the sound that terrified her. Even over the wind she could hear the rhythmic clang, 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 clang of something heavy, hitting something unyielding. Silas dismounted. He hit the ground with a heavy thud that shook the snow from his boots. He didn't offer a hand. He simply reached up, grabbed her by the waist, and swung her down. Her legs gave way the moment her boots touched the snow. She crumpled into a heap. Silas caught her by the scruff of her coat, hauling her upright. He didn't carry her like a princess. He marched her toward the massive double doors, his hand firm on her arm, dragging her along. He kicked the door open. Heat hit her like a physical blow. It was dry, intense, and smelled of burning coal. They stepped inside. Elora gasped. It wasn't just a cabin, it was a forge. The center of the room was dominated by a massive stone hearth that roared with an orange, hellish fire. An anvil the size of a cow stood in the middle of the floor. Racks of hammers, tongs, and strange, twisted metal shapes lined the walls. Everything was coated in a fine layer of black soot. In the corner, almost as an afterthought, was a small living area, a rough table, a single chair, and a bed piled with furs. Silas released her. He walked straight to the forge. He picked up a pair of tongs, grabbed a glowing piece of iron from the fire, and plunged it into a barrel of water. Steam exploded into the room with a violent hiss. He turned to her. He was covered in soot, sweat streaking through the grime on his face. He looked like a demon tending the fires of the underworld. He pointed to the corner. "Stay," he growled. Elora nodded, her teeth chattering. She walked to the corner, feeling small and utterly out of place in this cathedral of fire and iron. She saw a pile of old blankets on the floor near the hearth. A dog bed, perhaps? Or just rags? Silas went back to work. For 3 days, she lived in the corner. Silas ignored her. He was a machine. He woke before dawn, stoked the fire, and hammered until late into the night. He ate hardtack dry, burnt biscuits that looked like stones, and drank water from a tin cup. He didn't offer her food. He pointed to a sack of flour and a barrel of dried beans in the larder, and went back to his anvil. Elora was terrified. She was also starving. But she was also Elora Vance. She had run a farm when her father was drunk. She had kept the books. She had survived. On the 4th morning, Silas left. He took his rifle and disappeared into the snow without a word. Elora stood up. Her legs were shaky, but her resolve was iron. She looked at the forge. It was a mess. Tools were scattered. Coal dust lay thick on the floor. The larder was disorganized. She found a broom made of stiff twigs. She began to sweep. She swept until her arms burned. She swept the soot into a pile and shoveled it out the door. She found a bucket and scrubbed the floorboards until the wood showed through the black grime. Then she turned to the larder. She found the flour. She found a jar of yeast that looked old but viable. She found a tin of lard. She mixed the dough. She kneaded it on the table, putting all her frustration, all her fear into the motion. Push, turn, fold, push, turn, fold. She stoked the small side oven built into the main hearth. She put the bread in. While it baked, she found a piece of venison hanging in the cold storage room at the back of the cave. She cut it into cubes. She found onions in a root cellar. She made a stew. By late afternoon, the cabin smelled different. It didn't smell like sulfur and sweat anymore. It smelled of yeast. It smelled of roasting meat and caramelized onions. It smelled of home. The door opened. Silas stomped in, covered in snow, a dead buck slung over his shoulder. He dropped the deer by the door with a heavy thud. He stopped. He sniffed the air. His nose wrinkled. He looked confused, like a bear waking up in the wrong den. He looked at the floor. Clean. He looked at the table, set with 2 tin plates and 2 cups. He looked at the fire. A pot bubbled merrily. He looked at Alara. She stood by the hearth, wiping her hands on a rag. Her scar was flushed from the heat of the oven. She was terrified he would be angry. She was terrified he would throw the food out. Silas walked to the table. He stared at the loaf of bread sitting in the center. It was golden brown, rising high, soft and perfect. He reached out with a soot-stained hand. He touched the crust. It yielded under his finger. He looked at Alara. His amber eyes were wide. He looked at the bread. Then he looked at the hardtack biscuits still sitting on the shelf, gray, rock-hard, unappealing. He pulled out the single chair. He sat down heavily. He didn't speak. He picked up the knife. He cut a slice of the warm bread. Steam rose from the white interior. He took a bite. Alara held her breath. Silas chewed slowly. He closed his eyes. A look of pure, unadulterated pleasure crossed his face. He let out a long sigh that seemed to deflate his massive shoulders. He opened his eyes and looked at her. He pointed to the other side of the table. He pointed to an empty crate he used for storage. He kicked the crate toward the table. "Sit," he grumbled, his mouth full of bread. Alara sat. Silas cut another slice. He pushed it toward her. He poured stew into her bowl. He didn't say thank you. He didn't smile, but he ate 3 bowls of stew and half the loaf of bread. And when he was finished, he didn't go back to the anvil. He sat by the fire, watching her clean the plates, a strange, thoughtful expression on his scarred face, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle he hadn't known existed. The blizzard that descended on the devil's throat was not merely a weather event, it was a siege. For 3 days and 3 nights, the world outside the heavy oak doors ceased to exist. There was only the white, screaming void pressing against the logs, piling drifts so high they blocked the high windows, sealing Alara and Silas in a twilight world of firelight and shadows. The cabin became a capsule of heat and iron scent. The forge didn't sleep, and neither did Silas. The storm seemed to make him restless, driving him to the anvil with a manic energy. He hammered until the rhythmic clang, clang, clang vibrated in Alara's teeth. She moved around him like a moon orbiting a volatile planet, careful, quiet, keeping the coffee hot and the floor swept, but constantly aware of his massive, brooding gravity. On the 4th night the accident happened. It was late. The candle had burned down to a nub. Silas was working a piece of complex scrollwork for a gate, twisting red-hot iron with a pair of heavy tongs. He was exhausted. Alara could see it in the slight tremor of his forearms, usually as steady as granite. He turned to plunge the metal into the slack tub. His boot caught on a piece of coal he hadn't swept up. He stumbled. The tongs slipped. The glowing iron lashed out like a snake. It didn't hit him, but in his attempt to catch himself, his hand, his bare, ungloved right hand slammed down onto the jagged edge of a rusted sheet of scrap metal leaning against the workbench. The sound was sickening, wet and tearing. Silas didn't scream. He made a low, guttural noise in his throat, like a wolf snapping its jaws. He dropped the tongs. The hot iron sizzled on the floorboards, scorching the wood. Alara was there in a heartbeat. She kicked the hot iron away from the wall with her boot and grabbed the water bucket. "Let me see," she ordered. Silas clutched his right hand to his chest, his face gray beneath the soot. Blood dark and thick welled up between his fingers, dripping onto the floor with a steady pat, pat, pat. He shook his head, backing away. "Fine," he grunted, his voice tight with pain, "just a scratch." "It's not a scratch, Silas," Elara said, her voice rising. "It's jagged. It's rust. If you don't clean it, the lockjaw will take you before the snow melts." She didn't wait for his permission. She grabbed his good arm. He was immovable, a statue of stubborn pride, but she dug her heels in. "Sit," she commanded. She pointed to the chair by the table. "Now." Silas looked at her. He looked at the blood pooling at his feet. He looked at the fierce light in her eyes, the same light he had seen when she baked the bread. He sat. The chair groaned under his weight. Elara went to work. She was terrified there was so much blood, but she shoved the fear down into the same dark place she kept the memories of the auction. She fetched the whiskey bottle. She fetched the needle and thread she used for mending clothes. She grabbed a clean rag. She pulled a stool over and sat in front of him, their knees almost touching. "Give it to me," she said. Silas hesitated. Then slowly, he uncurled his arm and laid his hand in her lap. Elara hissed. The cut was deep. It ran from the base of his thumb across the palm, laying the flesh open to the bone. Rust flakes were embedded in the wound. "This is going to hurt," she whispered. She poured the whiskey. Silas's whole body jerked. His free hand gripped the edge of the table so hard the wood splintered. A groan tore itself from his chest, a raw, animal sound of agony. "Breathe," Elara murmured, her hands moving quickly. She used the rag to scrub the rust out. The blood turned the water in the basin pink, then red. When it was clean, she threaded the needle. She held it in the flame of the candle until it glowed. "Look at me," she said. Silas lifted his head. His face was beaded with sweat. His amber eyes were wide, the pupils blown with pain. He looked at her scar. He looked at the ruin of her face. "Don't look at the hand," she said softly. "Look at the fire." She pierced the skin. Silas flinched, his leg jumping, his knee hitting hers, but he didn't pull away. He let her sew him back together. Stitch by stitch, she closed the wound. The silence in the cabin was heavy, broken only by the hiss of the fire and the ragged sound of Silas's breathing. Elara worked with a surgeon's focus, her small, scarred hands moving with a grace that belied the brutality of the task. "Done," she whispered finally, tying off the knot and biting the thread. She wrapped his hand in clean linen, binding it tight. Silas didn't move. He stared at his bandaged hand, then up at her. The adrenaline was fading, leaving him slumped and vulnerable. "You have steady hands," he rasped. "Farm hands," Elara replied, wiping the blood from her fingers. "You learn to fix things when there's no money for a doctor." She stood up to take the basin away, but Silas reached out with his good hand and caught her wrist. He didn't pull, he just held her. "Why?" he asked. Elara looked down at him. "Why what?" "Why do you stay?" Silas's voice was rougher than usual. "I bought you like a mule. I treat you like a ghost. I live in a cave." He looked around the soot-stained cabin. "You could have run. When I was hunting, you could have taken the horse." Elara sat back down on the stool. The firelight danced across her face, illuminating the stark divide between beauty and ruin. "Run where?" she asked quietly. "To Oakhaven? To the people who laughed when Abernathy tore my veil off?" She touched her scar. "There is no place for a monster down there, Silas. They see this." She traced the melted skin, and they stopped seeing the person. Silas watched her hand. He released her wrist and slowly, tentatively, reached up. His fingers were rough, stained with coal dust and iron filings. He didn't touch her good cheek. He touched the scar. Elara froze. She held her breath, waiting for the disgust, waiting for him to realize how ugly it felt, like old parchment, tight and uneven. He didn't pull away. He traced the line of it with his thumb, his touch incredibly gentle for a man who bent iron. "What happened?" he asked. It was a demand, but soft. "A lantern," Elara whispered. "My father, he was drunk. He threw it. It hit the wall. The oil exploded." She looked into the fire, remembering the heat, the smell of burning hair, the screaming. "He got out. My mother didn't. I tried to pull her, but the roof came down." She looked back at Silas. "I survived. That was my sin. I survived, and I was ugly. My father never forgave me for being the one who walked out of the fire." Silas's hand lingered on her face. His thumb brushed the edge of her eye. "Fire takes," he rumbled. "It takes and it leaves ash." He pulled his hand back and looked at his own palms, one bandaged, one scarred from 1,000 burns. "I had a brother," he said. Elara blinked. It was the first time he had spoken of his past. "Elias," Silas continued, staring into the flames, "we worked the deep mines before I was a smith. We were setting charges." His voice grew tight, the words scraping against his throat. "The timber was rot. I told the foreman. He didn't listen." He clenched his good fist. "The roof came down, just like yours, but it wasn't fire. It was rock. Elias was pinned. I could see him. I could reach his hand." Silas looked at his hand. The fingers curled as if grasping a ghost. "I held him. I tried to lift the beam. I pulled until the muscles in my back tore. I pulled until I screamed. I screamed so loud my voice broke." He touched his throat. "It didn't matter. The rock was heavier. I held his hand until it went cold." He looked at Elara, his eyes swimming with a grief that had been hardening for 10 years. "I walked out. He didn't. I stopped speaking because there were no words left, just noise." He looked at the forge, at the cold iron anvil. "I came here. I learned to work the iron, because iron doesn't rot, iron doesn't break. If I can make it strong enough, maybe next time." He trailed off. Elara understood. He wasn't forging gates and tools. He was trying to forge a world where things didn't collapse. He was trying to build a cage strong enough to keep death out. She reached out and took his good hand. She placed it on the table, covering it with her own. "It wasn't your fault, Silas," she whispered, "just like the lantern wasn't mine." Silas looked at their hands, his large and dark with soot, her small and pale and scarred, 2 broken things resting on the wood. "We are the same," he murmured, "forged in the bad fire." He turned his hand over and gripped hers. It wasn't the grip of a master claiming a slave. It was the grip of a drowning man finding a lifeline. "Elara," he said. It was the first time he had used her name. He leaned forward. The firelight cast long shadows across the room, turning the cabin into a private world. "You are not ugly," he said, his voice low and fierce. "The town, they are blind. They see the scar. I see the woman who stitched me up while her hands shook. I see the iron." He reached out again, touching the scar on her neck. "Iron is beautiful," he whispered, "because it survives." Elara felt a tear slide down her cheek, not from the good eye, but from the scarred one. Silas caught it with his thumb. For a long moment they sat there, the storm howling outside, the fire popping inside, bound together by the confession of their wounds. The barrier between them, the wall of silence and fear, had been breached, and in the space between them, something fragile and new began to grow, something warmer than the forge and stronger than the storm. Which country are you watching this video from? Please let me know in the comments below. The spring thaw did not come gently to the devil's throat. It arrived with the violence of a breaking fever. The silence of the deep winter was shattered by the roar of the creek, swollen with meltwater and mud, tearing through the ravine below the cabin like a brown scar. The icicles that had hung like daggers from the eaves for months lost their grip, crashing onto the porch with startling glass-like explosions. Inside the forge, the rhythm of life had shifted. The air was no longer just hot. It was humid, thick with the smell of wet earth and the eternal metallic tang of the coal fire. Elara stood by the bellows, her face flushed, sweat causing her shirt to cling to her back. She pumped the handle, whoosh, huff, shoosh, huff, feeding the orange heart of the forge. Her arms, once thin and trembling, had grown wiry and strong over the long winter. She wore a leather apron Silas had cut down for her, cinched tight at the waist. Silas stood at the anvil. His right hand was still bandaged, the linen stark white against his soot-stained skin, but he wielded the hammer with his left hand now. He was slower, less precise, but the force was still terrifying. Clang! Sparks showered the floor. Clang! He was shaping a hinge, bending the stubborn iron to his will. He paused, wiping his brow with his forearm. He looked at Elara. The amber fire in his eyes had softened over the months, replaced by a quiet, steady warmth. He didn't speak. He rarely did, but he nodded. It was a language they had built in the silence. Good heat. Good work. We are a team. Suddenly, Cinder, the old wolf dog who slept by the coal bin, lifted his head. His ears swiveled forward. A low growl started deep in his chest, vibrating through the floorboards. Silas went still. The hammer hovered in the air. Thud-thud. It wasn't the rhythmic pounding of the anvil. It was hoofbeats, many of them, scrambling up the shale path that was treacherous even in dry weather. Elara let go of the bellows. The fire hissed as the air supply cut off. "Silas?" she whispered. Silas moved to the window, staying in the shadows. He peered through the grime-streaked glass. His jaw tightened, the muscles bunching beneath his beard. "Get back," he rasped, "into the larder." Elara didn't move. She stepped up beside him. Down in the yard, emerging from the mist like ghosts from a bad dream, were 5 riders. They were mud-spattered, their horses heaving from the climb. Leading them, perched on a nervous mare, was Mayor Abernathy. He looked different than he had on the auction block. He wore a heavy oilskin coat and a hat pulled low, but his face was unmistakable, twisted with a frantic, feverish greed. Flanking him were 4 men. Elara didn't recognize, hired guns with low-slung holsters and eyes that scanned the property with professional detachment. "Vane!" Abernathy shouted, his voice cracking against the roar of the creek. "Silas Vane! Come out! We have business!" Silas turned from the window. He looked at Elara. "Stay inside," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. He grabbed a heavy iron pry bar from the corner. He hadn't had time to reach for his rifle, which leaned against the porch rail outside. He shoved the heavy oak door open and stepped onto the porch. He filled the doorway, a monolith of black leather and menace. "Get off my land," Silas rumbled. Abernathy laughed, a high, nervous sound. "Your land? That's a matter of debate, Mr. Vane. You see, we've been examining the payment you made last winter." He reached into his pocket and pulled out one of the gold coins Silas had thrown. He held it up to the weak spring sunlight. "Spanish gold," Abernathy shouted, his eyes gleaming. "Minted 1790. Rare. Very rare. And where there's one coin, there's a chest. Where there's a chest, there's a mine." He signaled to the men behind him. They unholstered their revolvers. "The transaction was irregular," Abernathy screamed, dropping the pretense of legality. "You underpaid. We're here to collect the interest. Hand over the hoard, Vane, and maybe we let you keep the cripple." Elara, watching from the crack in the doorframe, felt a cold knot of rage tighten in her stomach. The cripple. That word again. "There is no hoard," Silas growled. "Leave." "Liar!" Abernathy shrieked. He nodded to the man on his right, a scarred drifter with a double-barreled shotgun. "Smoke him out!" The drifter didn't aim at Silas. He aimed at the lean-to attached to the side of the cabin, the woodshed, where the winter's dry kindling was stacked. Boom! The shotgun roared. The blast didn't hit flesh, it hit a kerosene lantern hanging on the woodshed post. The glass shattered. The oil ignited. Fire! The flames leaped up the dry logs with terrifying speed. The smoke billowed black and thick, curling around the porch. Ilara screamed. It was a reflex. The smell of burning wood, the crackle of the flames, her Terence died all over again. She fell back against the anvil, her hands flying to her face, covering the scar. Outside, Cinder lunged. The old dog flew off the porch, barking furiously, defending his pack. "Put that mutt down," Abernathy yelled. Crack! A pistol shot rang out. Cinder yelped a high, sharp sound and tumbled into the mud, whimpering, dragging his hind legs. Something inside Silas' veins snapped. He didn't look at the fire. He didn't look at the guns. He looked at his dog bleeding in the mud. The Iron Man vanished. The beast emerged. He roared. It wasn't a word. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated fury that shook the icicles from the trees. He didn't retreat into the cabin. He charged. He leaped off the porch, bypassing the steps, landing in the mud with a splash that coated the nearest rider. He swung the iron pry bar with a speed that defied physics for a man of his size. Crunch! The bar connected with the leg of the shotgun wielder's horse. The animal screamed and reared, throwing the rider. Silas didn't stop. He was a whirlwind of violence. He grabbed the fallen rider by the collar and hurled him into the man beside him, knocking them both into the slush. "Shoot him! Shoot the freak!" Abernathy screamed, wheeling his horse around in panic. A bullet struck Silas in the thigh. He didn't even stumble. He barely seemed to feel it. He grabbed the pry bar with both hands, ignoring the pain in his injured palm, and swung it like a baseball bat into the ribs of a third gunman who was trying to aim. But there were too many of them. The fourth man, a cool-headed professional, had dismounted. He circled around the melee, aiming his Colt Navy revolver at Silas's exposed back. "Good night, blacksmith," the gunman muttered, cocking the hammer. Silas was occupied wrestling the shotgun away from the first attacker. He didn't see the man behind him. Inside the burning cabin, Ilara Vance looked at the fire. The smoke was filling the room. The heat was rising. The terror was clawing at her throat, telling her to curl into a ball, to hide, to let the fire take her again. "No," a voice whispered in her head. "Not this time." She looked at the forge. The coals were still glowing orange. She looked at the corner where Silas kept his varmint gun, a heavy Henry repeating rifle. He had taught her how to load it. Pull the lever. Seat the round. Squeeze. Don't pull. She wasn't a cripple. She wasn't a ledger entry. She was the woman who had stitched a giant's hand while he bled. She grabbed the rifle. It was heavy, smelling of oil and steel. She ran to the door. The smoke stung her eyes. Through the haze, she saw Silas fighting two men in the mud. She saw the third man, the professional, leveling his pistol at Silas's back. She didn't scream a warning. Screaming took time. She raised the rifle. She didn't aim for the head. Silas had taught her to aim for the biggest part of the target. She pressed the stock against her shoulder. She took a breath. She squeezed. The rifle kicked hard against her shoulder. The gunman's chest exploded in a puff of dust and blood. He spun around, dropping his pistol, a look of utter shock on his face as he collapsed backward into the mud. Silas froze. He turned, wild-eyed, expecting to see another enemy. He saw Ilara standing on the burning porch. The flames were licking at the roof above her, framing her in a halo of destruction. She worked the lever of the rifle, clack-clack, ejecting the spent shell and chambering a new one. Her face was set in stone. Her scar was glowing in the firelight. She looked like a Valkyrie of the forge. "Get away from him!" she screamed, leveling the rifle at Abernathy. Abernathy stared at her. He looked at his hired guns, one dead, two groaning in the mud with broken bones, one unconscious. He looked at Silas, who was now standing up, blood streaming from his leg, breathing like a steam engine. And he looked at the girl he had sold for $1, who was now holding a repeater with steady hands. "You," Abernathy stammered, "you're supposed to be broken." "I was forged," Elara yelled back. "Now run!" She fired a warning shot that kicked up the mud inches from Abernathy's horse. The horse bolted. Abernathy shrieked, clinging to the mane as the animal tore down the path, terrified by the fire and the noise. The remaining conscious gunmen didn't wait. They scrambled for their mounts, dragging their injured comrades, slipping and sliding in their haste to get away from the demon blacksmith and his fire witch bride. Silas didn't chase them. He watched them go until they disappeared into the trees. Then he turned to the cabin. The woodshed was fully engulfed. The flames were starting to eat at the main logs of the cabin. "Elara!" he roared, limping toward the porch. Elara didn't move. She dropped the rifle. She grabbed a bucket of water from the porch and threw it on the nearest flames. "The forge!" she shouted at him. "Use the slack tub. We saved the home." Silas snapped out of his battle fugue. He grabbed a shovel. He grabbed the water barrel. Together, the wounded giant and the scarred woman fought the fire. They threw snow. They threw water. They beat the flames with wet blankets. They fought with the same ferocity they had used against the men, refusing to let the world burn them down again. It took an hour. By the time the last ember hissed into steam, the woodshed was gone, and the side of the cabin was charred black. But the structure stood. The roof held. Elara collapsed on the damp, smoky porch, her face streaked with fresh soot, her hands blistered. Silas limped over to her. He dropped the shovel. He fell to his knees, ignoring his wounded leg. He grabbed her shoulders. His grip was desperate, shaking. "You came out," he whispered, staring at her wild eyes. "The fire! You came out!" "I told you," Elara panted, looking at the rifle lying in the mud. "I survived the fire once. I wasn't going to let it take what's mine." Silas looked at the dead gunman, then back at her. He realized then that he hadn't saved her from the town. She had saved him. He pulled her into his chest, burying his face in her smoky hair, rocking her back and forth as the adrenaline finally crashed, leaving them shivering in the wreckage of their victory. The smoke from the burning woodshed hung low in the valley, a gray shroud that smelled of pine pitch and the acrid metallic tang of spent gunpowder. Inside the cabin, the air was cooling rapidly as the sun dipped below the jagged rim of the Devil's Throat, casting long, bruised shadows across the soot-stained floorboards. Elara knelt beside the low cot near the hearth, her hands moving with a practiced, rhythmic efficiency that belied the trembling in her chest. A basin of warm water, tinged pink with blood, sat on the floor beside her. Silas lay back against the furs, his face gray and drawn, beads of sweat standing out on his forehead like pearls of oil. The bullet had passed through the meat of his thigh, clean through and through, miraculously missing the bone and the femoral artery. But the damage was ugly. "Hold still," Elara murmured, dipping a rag into the water. She wrung it out, the droplets falling back into the basin with a soft plip, plip, plip. Silas grunted as the warm cloth touched the raw edges of the wound. His knuckles, white where they gripped the edge of the cot, turned skeletal. He didn't look at his leg. He looked at the ceiling, his jaw working, grinding his teeth against the pane. "I should have checked the ridge," he rasped, his voice sounding hollow, stripped of its usual iron resonance. "I got careless. I let them get close." "You stopped them," Elara corrected gently, flushing the wound with a splash of diluted whiskey. Silas hissed through his teeth, his body arching off the mattress. "I killed a man in front of you," he choked out when the burning subsided. "I turned your home into a slaughterhouse." Elara stopped. She rested her hand on his uninjured knee. She looked at his face, the scar that ran through his beard, the eyes that were usually so fierce now clouded with a deep ancient shame. "You defended our home," she said firmly. "There is a difference." She finished binding the leg with strips of boiled linen. She washed her hands, the water turning a darker shade of red. Silas sat up, wincing. He swung his legs over the edge of the cot, testing his weight. He ignored her protest. He limped heavily to the loose floorboard near the anvil, the one he never stepped on. He knelt, groaning, and pried it up with the tip of a skinning knife. He pulled out a heavy iron box. It was rusted on the outside, but the lock was well oiled. He carried it to the table and set it down. Thud! He opened it. Inside lay the hoard: gold coins, Spanish doubloons, silver ingots from the old mines. It was a fortune. It was enough to buy Oakhaven 3 times over. It was the reason Abernathy had come. Silas pushed the box across the rough wood toward her. The coins clinked softly, a sound that seemed obscene in the quiet cabin. "Take it," Silas said. He didn't look at her. He looked at his hands that destroyed. Elara stared at the gold. It glittered in the firelight, cold and indifferent. "What is this?" she asked. "Freedom," Silas growled. "Abernathy is gone, but others will come. The story will spread. The blacksmith's gold, the monster's hoard." He looked up at her then, and the misery in his eyes broke her heart. "I am a lightning rod for violence, Elara. I was born in it. I live in it. Today proved it. I cannot keep you safe. I can only teach you how to kill." He gestured to the rifle leaning against the wall, the weapon she had used to save his life. He looked at it with revulsion. "You should not have to hold a gun," he whispered. "You should be soft. You should be in a place with gardens, with music, with people who don't smell like blood and coal." He pushed the box closer. "Take the horse. He knows the way down. Go to the city. Find a doctor who can fix." He gestured vaguely to her face, unable to say the words. "Find a life that fits you. A pretty life." Elara looked at the box. She looked at the gold that could buy her a new face, a new name, a new history. She looked at the man who was trying to cut his own heart out to save her. She reached out. She closed the lid of the box. Snap! She picked it up. It was heavy, straining her wrists. She walked past him. She walked to the forge. The fire was banked low, a bed of glowing orange coals that pulsed with heat. "Elara?" Silas said, confusion sharpening his voice. "What are you doing?" Elara stood before the fire. She turned to face him, the box held in her arms like a sacrifice. "You think I want a pretty life?" she asked, her voice trembling with a quiet fury. "You think I want to go down there and buy my way into their polite society? The same society that watched me on that auction block and did nothing?" She took a step toward him. "You think this," she tapped the box, "can fix me? You think a doctor can cut away the memory of the fire? You think money can make me whole?" "It can give you a chance," Silas argued, standing up, swaying on his bad leg. "A chance to be normal, to not be damaged." "I am not damaged," Elara screamed. The sound rang off the anvil. It echoed in the rafters. It silenced the wind outside. She dropped the box on the floor. She walked up to him, invading his space, forcing him to look down at her. "I am forged," she hissed, her eyes blazing. "Just like you, just like that iron you beat every day. You don't throw the iron away because it's been in the fire, Silas. You value it because it didn't melt." She grabbed his hand, the one she had stitched months ago, the one with the scar running across the palm. She pressed it to her own face. She pressed his rough, calloused palm against the melted skin of her cheek. She pressed it against the ridge of scar tissue that defined her life. "Feel it," she commanded. "Is it soft? No, it's tough. It's leather. It's armor." Silas froze. His hand engulfed her face. He felt the texture of her pain, the uneven landscape of her survival. "They called me damaged goods," Elara whispered, her voice breaking. "They screamed it, and for 10 years I believed them, until I met a man who lived in a cave and treated a broken bird like a queen." She looked up into his amber eyes, searching for the man beneath the beast. "You want to send me away because you're afraid," she said softly. "You're not afraid for me. You're afraid of me. You're afraid that, if I stay, you might actually have to be happy. You might have to believe that you deserve something other than a hammer and an anvil." Silas stared at her. The breath hitched in his chest. He looked at the woman who had shot a man to save him. He looked at the woman who had baked bread in his ashes. He realized she was right. He was terrified. He was terrified because for the first time in his life, he had something to lose. He didn't pull his hand away. Instead, his fingers curled, cupping her jaw, holding her face, as if it were made of fragile glass. "Elara," he choked out. He leaned down. He didn't kiss her lips. He tilted his head and pressed his lips to her cheek, to the left cheek, to the scar. Elara gasped, her eyes fluttered shut. His lips were warm, chapped and trembling. He kissed the ridge of the burn. He kissed the tight skin near her eye. He kissed the line of the scar down her neck. It wasn't a kiss of pity. It was a kiss of reverence. It was a worshipful, tender claiming of the very thing the world had told her to hide. "Not damaged," Silas whispered against her skin, his beard scratching softly against her neck. "Masterpiece." He pulled back just enough to look her in the eye. A tear leaked from his own eye, tracking through the soot on his face. "I cannot give you a garden," he rasped. "I cannot give you silence. I can only give you the fire, and the iron, and the hands that hold them." Elara reached up and wrapped her arms around his massive neck, burying her face in the hollow of his shoulder. "Then give me the fire," she breathed. "I'm cold without it." Silas let out a shuddering breath, a sound like a collapsing mine shaft, and wrapped his arms around her, lifting her off her feet, holding her tight against his chest. He buried his face in her hair, breathing in the scent of smoke and lavender soap, realizing that the fortress he had built to keep the world out had actually been built to keep this one, singular miracle in. Epilogue 1 year later. The winter that year was hard, burying the devil's throat in 10 feet of snow, but the spring that followed was glorious. The wildflowers exploded across the meadow in a riot of purple and gold, fed by the meltwater of the creek. The cabin still stood against the cliff, but it had changed. The blackened logs had been replaced. A new room had been added to the side, with a wide window that looked out over the valley, a window with glass that was polished until it sparkled. Smoke curled from the chimney, but it wasn't the black smoke of the coal fire. It was the white, sweet smoke of oak and applewood. Inside the forge, the rhythm of the hammer rang out, clang, clang. Silas Vane stood at the anvil. He was shirtless, his scars shining in the firelight, his muscles bunching as he worked a piece of glowing steel. He moved with a new ease, the limp in his leg almost gone, a relic of a battle won. He paused, wiping his brow, and looked toward the bellows. Elara stood there. She wore a heavy leather apron over a dress of blue calico. Her hair was tied back, revealing her face completely. The scar was there, shining silver in the light, but she no longer turned her head to hide it. She was reading a book while she pumped the handle, her lips moving silently with the words. Verse 3, Silas asked, his voice a low rumble that warmed the room. Elora looked up smiling. Verse 4, the one about the tiger. Silas chuckled a sound that still surprised the birds outside. Read it loud. The iron likes the rhythm. Elora began to read, her voice clear and strong, reciting poetry to the rhythm of the bellows and the hammer. As she read, Cinder the old wolf dog, now possessing a distinct limp and a patch of white fur where the bullet had grazed him, thumped his tail against the floorboards from his bed near the heat. Silas watched her. He watched the firelight dance on her face. He watched the way she stood, grounded and fierce, the queen of his soot-stained kingdom. He set the hammer down. He walked over to her. Elora stopped reading. She looked up at him, her eyes full of a peace she had fought for. Silas reached out. He took the book from her hand and set it on the workbench. He took her face in his large calloused hands. He leaned down and kissed her, this time on the lips, deep and slow and full of promise. Lunch, he murmured against her mouth. Then we finish the gate. Then we finish the gate, Elora agreed. She turned back to the bellows. Silas turned back to the anvil. Outside, the wind howled through the devil's throat, searching for the monsters that used to live there. But it found only a man and a woman, forged in the same fire, ringing out their own song of iron and love against the silence of the world. And to the people of Oakhaven, looking up at the smoke rising from the peak, it was no longer a warning. It was a beacon.